Welcome back, wanderers, to Sur Belecho, where every trail hides a secret and every shadow remembers your name. Before we step into tonight's darkness, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? Drop your city and your clock in the comments. I read every single one by the fire. And if you're new here, subscribe and ring that bell. The woods don't forgive those who walk in unprepared. Now, lock your doors. Dim the lights. The forest is waking up.
My name is Otohi Reed. I have been a park ranger for 11 years and 4 months. I took my current post in the Otter Hollow district of the Pisgah backcountry on a Tuesday in late September, and on the Wednesday after I arrived I began to understand that something out here has been waiting for me a long time. I should explain why I accepted the job, because if you do not understand that, the rest of this is just a man losing his mind in a wet forest. My grandfather on my mother's side was Eastern Band Cherokee. He raised me up the road from Cherokee, North Carolina, in a single-wide trailer with a tin roof that drummed like a heartbeat in the rain. He taught me to walk in mountains the way a person walks through a church, with respect for what came before, and with a soft foot. He also taught me that there are places in these old hills you do not call to, and places that should not be answered when they call to you. When I was 9, my brother Joseph went into the Pisgah on a school camping trip. He was 12. He walked away from his cabin one night to use the bathroom and never came back. They searched for 2 weeks. They never found him. My grandfather did not cry at the memorial. He went out on the porch and sat with his hands on his knees, and after a long while he said he was taken by something old. He never said another word about it. He was buried 2 winters later with his answer still inside him. I joined the Park Service in my early 20s because I thought, with a certain stupid arrogance, that if I learned the woods well enough I might find my brother, or whatever was left of him. By 33 I had worked the Smokies, the Cumberland Plateau, and a season up in Shenandoah. I was good at my job. I was respected. I had not found anything. Then in August of last year a position opened in Otter Hollow. The Otter Hollow district had not had a permanent ranger for almost 6 years. They had a series of seasonal hires, 2 of whom quit inside a month, and 1 who did not quit at all and was found 3 miles off trail with no shoes on, sitting upright against a beech tree, dead for what the coroner guessed was 4 days. Cause of death: exposure. He was 31 and in good health, and his radio was on his belt and turned to the right channel. The supervisor who interviewed me, a woman named Greer Halsey, told me about that ranger. She told me directly. She said, "I am required to disclose this. Otter Hollow has a high attrition rate and we have had incidents." She said the word incidents the way other people say regrets. I took the job that afternoon. Joseph went missing 4 ridges over from Otter Hollow. The cabin they assigned me sits at the southern end of a narrow lake the topo maps call Otter Hollow Pond, although nothing about it suggests a pond. It is a long, thin, dark thing, almost a mile end to end, hemmed in by ridges so steep that the sun only reaches the water for about 2 hours at midday. The locals around Brevard call it the slow lake because the water moves like cold syrup, and because if you drop something heavy in, it does not come back up where it should. The cabin is 2 rooms. There is a main room with a wood stove and a small kitchen, and a back room with a bed and a closet. There is a covered porch on the lakeside. There is a propane refrigerator, a hand pump well, a generator I am not supposed to use after 10 at night, and a satellite radio. My nearest neighbor is a logger named Wesley Boone, who lives 8 miles down a fire road in a single wide that smells like coffee and dog. The nearest paved road is 14 miles. Cell signal is a rumor. I drove in the afternoon of September 22nd. I unloaded my truck. I made coffee on the propane stove and drank it on the porch and watched the dusk lay itself down on the lake 1 inch at a time. The trees on the far ridge went black before the sky did. The water held the last gray light a long time after. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened that first night. I am not a man who startles. I have pulled bodies out of crevasses. I have put down a black bear from 12 feet with 1 shot. I have walked into a hunter's camp where he had been dead for a week in the August heat, and I did not lose my supper. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that when I describe what I heard from across the lake at 3:14 in the morning on my first night in Otter Hollow, it is the testimony of a steady person. I heard a voice, a man's voice. It was calling for help. The cabin sits maybe 40 feet from the water. Sound carries strangely on the lake, In the daytime, I had already noticed how a paddle stroke from the far end could pop right into the porch as if a man were standing in front of you. So when I heard the voice, my first thought was perfectly reasonable. There was someone on the far side of the lake, almost a mile away, who needed help. I sat up in bed. The voice came again. Hey, anybody out there? A pause. I'm hurt. I pulled on my boots and my jacket and grabbed my flashlight and the satellite radio and walked out onto the porch. The lake was a black mirror. The moon was a thumbnail. I scanned the far shore with my light. I could not see anything. The voice called again. Please, I'm hurt bad. I keyed the radio and reported a possible distressed party on the south end of Otter Hollow Pond. Dispatch acknowledged. I asked the voice, loud, Sir, I am a park ranger. Stay where you are. I am calling for help. Are you alone? There was a pause. The voice answered. I'm alone. I fell. I started down toward the dock to launch the canoe. I was halfway across the yard when the voice called again, and this time it was much closer. It was no longer on the far shore. It was in the trees behind my cabin, maybe 100 feet up the ridge. It said, I'm hurt bad, Atohi. Please come help me. I had been on station for 9 hours. I had spoken to no one in those woods. My name was not on the cabin sign. My name was not on the radio traffic with dispatch, only my call number. I stopped where I was. I stood in the yard with my flashlight pointed up the slope, and I did not move and I did not answer, and after maybe 30 seconds the voice tried once more, softer now, almost coaxing, almost a child wheedling for candy. Atohi, come help. I turned around and walked back to the cabin and locked the door. I sat in a chair facing the door with the radio in one hand and a hatchet in the other, and I did not sleep and I did not move until the gray came up over the ridge at 6. That was my first night. I want to walk you through the first 3 weeks at Otter Hollow because I know how this kind of story sounds when you tell only the bad parts. I know it sounds like I lost it the first night. I want you to understand that I worked. I did my job. I patrolled. I kept a paper logbook and a digital logbook, and I filled both. I made small talk with hikers at the trailhead. I checked permits. I cleared a downed beach from the Pincho Trail. I was by every external measure a competent ranger doing competent work. But I did 3 things differently from how a normal ranger would do them. First, I never answered when something called my name out of the trees. Not when it sounded like Joseph. Not when it sounded like my mother, who has been dead since I was 20. Not when, 2 weeks in, it sounded like Greer Halsey, my supervisor, calling from the lake at 5 in the afternoon, the day after I had spoken to her on the phone for half an hour. I did not answer. I learned to keep my mouth shut and my radio on the right channel, and to walk away from the sound, slowly, never running. Second, I kept the curtains closed at night. My grandfather used to say that a window at night is a mouth, and you should not let a mouth stand open while you sleep. Third, I read. The cabin came with a desk in the main room. The desk had 4 drawers. The bottom drawer had a false back, which I discovered on my 5th day when I dropped a pencil and pulled the drawer all the way out to find it. Behind the false back was a manila folder, and inside the manila folder was a cloth-bound logbook with a green cover, and inside that logbook were the handwritten records of a ranger named Marcus Bly who had occupied this cabin from 1976 to 1981. Marcus Bly was a careful man. His handwriting was small and even. He kept temperature, wind, water clarity, sightings of game. For the first 18 months he did this faithfully, the way I did, and his book reads like any ranger's book. In April of 1978 his entries change. On April 4 he wrote, heard a child crying west of the lake at 0220. No reports of missing party. Did not respond to voice. Returned to bed. On April 17 he wrote, heard my wife at the back of the cabin at 0145. My wife is in Asheville. There was no further comment. On May 3 he wrote, Bly Sr. called for me from the dock tonight. My father has been dead 22 years. I did not go to the dock. On June 11 he wrote one line that I read 3 times. Boone says they get hungrier in summer. Says do not feed them with an answer. I knew that name, Boone. My neighbor was a Boone. I asked Wesley about it the next time I drove down the fire road to drop off a saw I had borrowed. Wesley was in his 60s, with a beard the color of pipe tobacco and hands like split wood. He had a blue-tick coonhound named Slim who watched me from under the porch with the careful eyes of an animal that has seen things. I asked him if his family had been in Otter Hollow long. My grandfather logged the north end in '52, Wesley said. My father trapped this whole valley before the park took it. I was born up that fire road in a house that is no longer standing. I asked him if he had known a ranger named Bly. He squinted at me a long time. He said, "Marcus was my father's friend. They used to play checkers on this porch." I asked him what happened to Marcus. Wesley spit off the porch. He looked at the trees. He said, "Marcus made it to retirement, lived 8 more years in Hendersonville, died of a stroke in a Walmart, wrote a letter to my father 2 weeks before, said the dreams had finally stopped." I asked him what dreams. He looked at me then for a long time, and I watched him make a decision that he had clearly made before for other young men. "You hear voices yet?" he said. I told him I had. He nodded. He said, "All right, come inside, coffee is on." What Wesley told me over the next 2 hours I will summarize because he made me promise not to write it word for word. He said his people had been in this valley 3 generations on his father's side and 4 on his mother's, and the deal his great-grandfather struck with the valley in 1889 was simple. You do not answer voices in the trees. You do not eat anything you find growing wild on the eastern slope of the ridge above Slow Lake. You do not enter the water of the lake after dark, not even your hand, not even to wash a knife. You do not bury anyone in the hollow without burning their clothes first. And if by some bad luck you ever see what Wesley called the long one walking on the ridge at dusk, you do not look at it twice. You look once, you look down, and you walk. I asked him what the long one was. He said, "I do not know. I have only seen it once. I was 19. I have not been up that ridge since. I am 64. I asked if anyone had ever tried to study the valley. Researchers, folklorists, anyone. He said a woman from Chapel Hill came up in '92 with a tape recorder. Spent a night at the old church foundation. We found her tape recorder on the dock. We did not find her. Her car is still rusted out behind my barn. I keep it because I do not know what else to do with it. When I drove back to the cabin that evening, the light was already failing. I came around the last bend in the fire road and the lake was below me on my left and the cabin was a small gray shape at the south end. There was a man standing on my dock. I stopped the truck. I picked up the binoculars from the passenger seat. I focused on the dock. There was no one on the dock. I drove the rest of the way down. I parked. I did not get out. I sat in the truck for almost 10 minutes with the engine running and the headlights on the porch, and I watched the cabin the way you watch an animal in a trap to see if it is still alive. Nothing moved. The dock was empty. The porch was empty. I went inside. I locked the door. I closed the curtains. I sat in the chair facing the door with the radio in one hand and the hatchet in the other. Outside, very politely, very softly, my brother Joseph began to call my name. He kept it up until almost 3 in the morning. I did not answer. The first hard search of my tenure came on October 14, 22 days into my assignment. The call came from dispatch at 4:11 in the afternoon. A family of 4 had hiked up the Pinchot Trail that morning to picnic at the falls. At some point during lunch, the youngest child, an 8-year-old girl, had wandered off the rock outcrop where they were eating to follow a butterfly. She had been gone 40 minutes before her parents realized she was not behind them. Her name was Ruby Crenshaw. She was wearing a yellow rain jacket and pink sneakers. She had a small backpack with a stuffed bear in it. The county sent 2 deputies. Wesley Boone came up the fire road in his old Bronco with Slim in the back. 2 volunteers from the Brevard Fire Department came out. I was the senior ranger on scene because I was the only ranger on scene. The light would be gone in 3 hours. We organized a hasty search. I sent the parents back to the trailhead with one of the deputies because the father was beginning to come apart and I needed people I could direct. I put Wesley and Slim on the creek line because Slim could work a scent. I took the 2 volunteers with me up the ridge where a child following a butterfly might have gone. The other deputy held the outcrop in case Ruby came back to it on her own. We worked outward in a spiral pattern. We called her name at 30-second intervals. The protocol is to call, count to 30, listen, move, call again. A child will often answer if she hears her name and she is alive and conscious. Wesley's hound bayed once down by the creek and we all paused, but it was a deer crossing. At 5:48 in the evening, with maybe 40 minutes of usable light remaining, I heard her. She was up the slope from me maybe 200 yards, in a stand of hemlock above a deadfall. Her voice was small and wet and exactly like an 8-year-old girl crying, "Mommy, I want my mommy." The 2 volunteers were 30 yards downhill of me, working their own grid. They both stopped. They both heard it. One of them, a young man named Elijah, took a step uphill and called, "Ruby, sweetheart, stay where you are. We are coming to you." The voice answered him, "Help me." I fell. Elijah took another step. I caught his arm. I want to tell you what I did next very precisely, because I do not know if I did the right thing. The world outside this valley would not understand what I did. I keyed my radio. I asked the deputy at the outcrop for Ruby Crenshaw's middle name. He came back 10 seconds later. Ann, Ruby Ann Crenshaw. I called up the slope. Ruby Ann, this is Ranger Reed. Tell me your dog's name. There was a long silence in the hemlocks. Long enough that Elijah looked at me like I was insane. Long enough that the young woman, his partner, started to climb past me on her own. Then the voice answered. It said, in the same wet, 8-year-old crying, help me, I fell. I tightened my grip on Elijah's arm. I said very quietly, we are not going up there. We are going to walk down to the creek and we are going to meet Mr. Boone and we are going to do it now and we are not going to run. The young woman said, are you out of your mind? She is right there. I said, Ruby does not have a dog. I had seen the intake form an hour earlier. I had read it twice while I was waiting for the volunteers to arrive. The Crenshaws had no pets. The form was specific. They had asked the parents about pets in case Ruby had a familiar animal name we could call. Elijah looked at me. He looked up the slope. He looked back at me. The young woman, whose name I never learned because I did not work with her again, refused to come with us. She climbed up toward the hemlocks. She said she would not leave a child up there because of a ranger's superstition. I stood at the deadfall and I listened to her climb for about 3 minutes. I heard her call Ruby's name. I heard her say, honey, I am right here. Stay with me. I heard her say, oh, sweetie, oh. I heard her voice lift and warm in the way a person's voice does when she has finally found a child she was afraid was dead. Then I heard her stop talking. There was no scream, there was no struggle, there was only the silence of the woods, the wind in the hemlocks, and after about 15 seconds, her voice again calling down the slope. She said, Elijah, Ranger Reed, I have her, come up, she is hurt, come up. The voice was perfect. It was her voice exactly. I had spoken to that woman for 10 minutes at the trailhead. I had heard her tell a joke about her dog. The voice on the slope was her voice. Elijah took a step uphill. I caught him a second time and I drove him down to his knees and I put my mouth next to his ear and I said, if you go up that hill, you do not come back. Do you understand me? Do you understand me? I do not know what he saw in my face. He started to shake. He nodded. We went down to the creek on our hands and feet half the way, and we found Wesley, and we told him. Wesley listened. He did not interrupt. When we were done, he keyed his own radio and called the deputy at the outcrop and said, pull everybody back to the trailhead. Now. I do not care. Now. We found Ruby Crenshaw at 7:22 the next morning, alive, asleep in a hollow log a quarter-mile downstream of where her parents had picnicked. She had a scrape on her knee. She did not remember most of the night. She said a tall man had walked her to the log and told her to stay there until morning, and that he had told her not to answer if anyone called her name in the dark, even her mommy. She described the tall man as having a face she could not look at directly, and she said his coat smelled like rain and old wood. We never found the volunteer. We searched 4 days. Wesley took me aside on the 3rd day and said very kindly, son, you are not going to find her. Stop walking up that ridge. You stop right now. I stopped. I drove down to Cherokee that weekend. I went to see an elder my grandfather had known, a woman in her 90s who lived in a small brick house behind the cultural center. Her name was Mama Hattie, and she was the last living person who had known my grandfather as a young man. I told her where I was working. I told her what I had heard. She closed her eyes. She sat with her hands on her knees the way my grandfather used to sit. After a long while she opened her eyes and she looked at me and she said, why did you take that job, Atohi? I told her about Joseph. She nodded as if I had confirmed something she already suspected. She said, then you have to be careful in a way that other men do not have to be careful. The thing in that valley remembers your blood. Your brother's mouth is in its throat now. It will use what it has. She told me other things. I will not write them all here. But she told me one thing I want you to know. She said if it ever asks you for help in your brother's voice, and you find yourself wanting to go, I want you to remember this. The dead do not need help. Only the hungry need help. Anything in those woods that asks you for help is hungry. Do not feed it. I drove back to Otter Hollow that night. The lake was black. The cabin was waiting. The thing about working alone in a cabin in the deep woods is that your routines become a kind of prayer. You make coffee at the same hour. You step out onto the porch at the same hour. You log the lake temperature at the same hour. After a while, the routines hold you upright. They become the only proof you have that you are still a person and not a thing that has begun to drift. After Mama Hattie, I added new routines. I salted the four corners of the cabin every Sunday. Mama Hattie had told me to. She had given me a small cloth bag of what she called old salt, which was just kosher salt with a little bit of ash in it from a fire she did not explain, and I did what she asked. I am a Park Service employee with an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology. I do not believe in much. I salted the corners anyway. I burned a cedar bundle on the porch every Wednesday at dusk. She had given me 3 of those too. I kept a notebook of every voice I heard outside the cabin and what it said and what time and from what direction. I do not know why. I think I wanted a record in case I disappeared so that whoever found my notebook would know I had not just walked off into the lake of my own accord. The notebook from October 18 to November 6 has 57 entries. Some of them I will give you because I want you to feel the way they felt to write. October 19, 0312. Joseph, South-Southwest. Atohai, I am cold, I want to go home. October 21, 0040. Greer Halsey, from the dock. Reed, are you in there? I drove up. I need you to come out. October 23, 0227. A child, did not give a name. North. Mister, can you hear me? My mom is hurt. October 26, 0155. My grandfather. Inside the wood line directly behind the cabin, very close. Walasi, Walasi, come outside. Walasi, what killed me as a small child. It means frog. No one alive should know that name. October 30, 0301. A woman crying, did not speak. Lakeside, November 2/3, 0418. The volunteer from the search. Elijah, Ranger Reed. I have her, come up. November 6th, 0233. My own voice, calling my own name. I want to talk about that last one, because that was the night I almost broke. Hearing your own voice from outside your cabin in the dark is a thing I would not wish on anyone. There is a part of your brain that simply will not accept it. It does not sound like a recording. It sounds the way you sound when you speak inside your own skull. And to hear that from the other side of a wall is a kind of insult to the structure of being a person. I sat in my chair facing the door, the way I always did, and I listened to myself stand in my own yard and call, very gently, Atohi, I forgot the lantern in the canoe. Come help me get it. I had not used the canoe in 2 weeks. There was no lantern in it. I knew this. I knew this completely. And still, for one terrible second, I thought, did I forget the lantern? Did I sleepwalk? Is that me? My hand was on the doorknob before I understood what I was doing. I let go of the knob. I sat back down. I put my forehead on my knees. I breathed in the way Mama Hattie had told me to breathe, which is the way my grandfather used to breathe when he was tracking and he wanted to slow his heart. The voice in the yard waited about 10 minutes and then it went away. I did not sleep that night. I did not sleep most of those nights. By the second week of November, I was a thin gray thing with a headache that did not stop. I called Wesley one afternoon and asked if I could come over and sit on his porch for a few hours and not talk. He said yes. I drove down. I sat on his porch. Slim put his head on my boot. Wesley made coffee. We did not speak for about an hour and a half. When he finally did speak, he said, "You have seen it yet? The long one?" I told him I had not. He said, "You will." I saw it 3 days later. It was the 11th of November, a Tuesday, about 20 minutes before sunset. I was on the porch with binoculars, doing a wildlife count along the eastern ridge as part of a quarterly survey. The light was thin and gold and the trees were already losing their leaves. I had picked out 2 white-tailed daws and a turkey on the slope and was sweeping back to the south to log the time. There was a figure on the ridge. It was standing between 2 large oaks at the high point of the ridge above the lake. It was upright. It was tall. At first I thought it was a man, a hiker who had wandered off the trail, and my stomach went cold the way it does when you realize someone is in trouble, and I steadied the binoculars on the porch rail to get a better look. It was not a man. I am going to describe what I saw, and I want you to understand that I am describing it carefully because I have thought about this for months and I want to get it right. It was about 7 feet tall. It was very narrow. It was the color of bark, or of skin that has been wet for a long time. Its arms were long enough that its hands hung below its knees. Its shoulders sloped wrong, the way the shoulders of a person who has been hanged for a while slope. Its head was small for its body, and it was tilted to one side, hard, almost lying on its own shoulder, as if the neck were broken. It was looking at me. Through the binoculars, at 400 yards in low light, I could see that its face was not a face. It was a smooth area where a face should be, with two dark places set too far apart, and a long vertical opening underneath that I think was a mouth, although I will not swear to it. I remembered Wesley's rule: you look once, you look down, you walk. I lowered the binoculars. I looked at the porch boards. I counted to 10. I went inside the cabin. I locked the door. I closed the curtains. I sat in the chair. I did not look out a window for 2 days. On the third day I made myself look. I went out on the porch at noon when the sun was the strongest it would be. The ridge was empty. The lake was calm. A pair of ravens were arguing about something in a beach, but on the south wall of the cabin, at a height of about 7 feet, there was a long, shallow scrape in the cedar siding, as if something tall and thin had leaned against my cabin in the night and dragged itself slowly along it before stepping back into the trees. I measured the scrape. It was 46 inches long. The wood was raised at the end as if from a fingernail. I called Wesley. He came up the road within an hour. He looked at the scrape. He did not touch it. He said, "It is taking your measure, son. Tell me what you want to do." I told him I wanted to know why my brother's voice was being used, and I wanted to know if there was any version of going up that ridge that did not end with me dead. He thought about it for a long time. He said, "There may be one, but I will not go with you. And if you do it before the first hard freeze, because after the freeze it gets bolder, and I do not like the way you look already." I asked him when the first hard freeze was likely. He said 11 days. I went up the ridge on the morning of November 18. Wesley had not lied to me. The freeze was coming. The forecast said the night of the 19th would drop into the low teens with wind. Whatever I was going to do, I was going to do in the daylight before that night. I had spent the 11 days getting ready in the only ways I knew how. I had driven down to Cherokee a second time, and I had sat with Mama Hattie for a long afternoon. She had given me a third bag, this one smaller, of something I did not look at. She had told me what to do with it. She had also told me what not to do, which was the longer list. She had said, "It is not your brother. Do you understand? It has eaten the part of him that made the sound. That is all it has. It does not have his soul. His soul was loosed when he died, and it went where it went. The thing on that ridge is a mouth wearing a memory. Do you understand?" I had told her I understood. She had said, "Say it again to me at the top of the ridge, when it speaks to you, and you will live." I had said it again to her at her kitchen table. She had said, "You will say it again at the top of the ridge." I packed for a day hike: water, a sandwich, a first aid kit, my radio, a knife, a sidearm I had never drawn at work and did not expect to draw now, the cloth bag from Mama Hattie, a wooden match in a metal case, and a small folded piece of paper with my brother's name on it, which she had told me to write that morning before I left. I had written it in pencil because she had told me to. Joseph Reed, June 4, 1972 to November 7, 1985, presumed. I left the cabin at 7:45. The light was good. Frost was on the porch boards. The lake was holding a thin mist about a foot above the water, like a sheet that had not yet been pulled flat. The trail up the eastern ridge is not a maintained trail. It is a fall line that the deer use and that the loggers used 100 years ago. I went up steady. I did not stop to rest until I was near the top, because once I was on the ridge I knew I would not want to be still. The top of the ridge is a flat run, maybe 100 yards long, between two high points. Wesley had told me to go to the southern high point because that was where the old ones had been left. I did not ask him what he meant by old ones. I think I understood. There is a clearing at the southern high point. It is round. The trees do not grow inside it, which is the kind of detail I would have explained away in my biology classes as being about soil composition or wind exposure, but standing there I did not try to explain it. Inside the clearing the ground is paler than it should be, almost white, the way ground gets in places where something has been spilled into it for a long, long time. I walked into the clearing at 9:52 in the morning. The wind died when I crossed the edge. That is not a thing I am inventing. I have been in places where the wind broke around a ridge and you got a quiet pocket. This was not that. The wind on either side of the clearing kept moving. Inside the clearing the air did not move at all. I could hear my own breath in my ears like I was wearing a helmet. I did what Mama Hattie had told me to do. I am not going to write down all of it. I will tell you what mattered. I walked to the center of the clearing. I knelt. I unfolded the paper with Joseph's name on it. I laid it on the ground. I poured the contents of the small bag onto the paper. It was a mixture I will not describe. I covered the paper and the contents with my left hand. I struck the match against the metal case with my right. I lit the paper. I let it burn. While it burned, I said out loud my brother's full name, his birthday, and the day he was last seen. I said, he is not here. He is not here. He is not here. The fire on the paper went out faster than it should have. The paper curled up small and black. The white ground underneath was not scorched. The clearing was still. The wind was still moving outside. Then, from the trees on the north end of the clearing, my brother stepped out. I want to be very clear about this part. I want to be clear because I have read accounts of moments like this from other people, and they always sound like they are exaggerating, and I want you to know that I am trying not to. He looked 12. He was wearing the red windbreaker he had been wearing the night he disappeared. His hair was the way I remembered it, a little long, parted in the middle the way our mother used to part it. He was not muddy. He was not hurt. He looked like a boy who had walked out of a school photo from 1985. He said, Atohi, I have been waiting. I said, he is not here. He said, it is me. It is really me. I got lost. I never died. I have been living up here. Please, take me home. I said, he is not here. He started to cry. His face did the small twisting thing my brother's face had done when he was about to cry. I had not seen that twist in 26 years. I had not realized I remembered it until I saw it again. I said, he is not here. The thing wearing my brother stopped crying. It stood very still. It tilted its head, hard, until its ear was almost on its shoulder. Behind it, between the trees on the ridge, I saw the long one. It was watching. It was the height I remembered. It was the color I remembered. Its head was tilted the same way as the boy's head, in the same direction, at the same angle, like a mirror I did not want to look into. The boy opened his mouth. The voice that came out was not my brother's voice anymore. It was a low, wet, slow sound, and it formed words, and the words it formed were, we are very hungry, Atohi. I stood up. I did not run. I walked backwards out of the clearing without taking my eyes off the ground. I walked back along the ridge to the fall line. I went down the fall line as fast as I could without falling. I did not look behind me. I did not stop. When I came out of the trees at the lake, Wesley's Bronco was at my cabin. He was sitting on my porch with Slim. He had a thermos. He poured me a cup without saying anything, and I drank it standing up because my legs would not bend. He said, you came back? I said, I came back. He said, was it him? I said, it was not him. He nodded once, slowly. He said, then you did it right. The freeze came that night, the way it had been forecast. It dropped to 11 degrees on the porch thermometer. The lake skinned over by morning. I worked Otter Hollow through the rest of that winter. I am working it still. The voices have not stopped. I do not expect them to stop. They are quieter now, and they no longer use my brother. I think the thing on the ridge knows that voice is spent. It uses other voices. It will use any voice it can get hold of. 2 weeks ago it used the volunteer from the search, calling for Elijah, and I had to drive Elijah, who comes up sometimes to sit with me, down to Brevard at 3 in the morning because he could not stop shaking. I have not gone back up that ridge. I will not. I do not believe I am owed any other answer than the one I got in that clearing. If you are reading this and you ever take a job like mine in a valley like this, I want to tell you the only thing that matters. I want to tell you what my grandfather told me, and what Mama Hattie told me, and what Wesley Boone told me the first night I sat on his porch, and what Marcus Bly wrote in his green logbook in 1978. The dead do not need help. Only the hungry need help. Anything in those woods that asks you for help is hungry. Do not feed it. I have been a federal employee for 19 years, the last 12 of those wearing the flat-brimmed Stetson of the National Park Service. I tell you this not because it matters to the story, but because I want you to understand that I am not the kind of person who imagines things. I file reports. I follow protocol. I keep my radio battery charged and my boots oiled and my sidearm clean. The men I came up with would tell you Tahoma Red Crow is the dullest, most procedural ranger in the Western District. Some of them used that word as an insult. I always took it as a compliment. So when I tell you what happened at Hollow Antler Lake this past autumn, I need you to hear it the way a witness gives testimony. Not as a campfire story, not as something I am embellishing for effect. I am writing this down because 3 other rangers have died in that drainage over the last 40 years, and the Park Service has filed every one of those deaths under exposure or fall or presumed drowning. My father was the second name on that list. I think I know now what really took him. Hollow Antler is not on any visitor map you can buy at the West Glacier gift shop. It sits in a glacial bowl about 11 miles north of Logging Lake, on the western edge of the park, deep in country that the agency officially classifies as wilderness recommended, meaning no trails are maintained, no signage exists, and the only structure for 10 miles in any direction is the patrol cabin at the southwestern shore. The cabin was built by the CCC in 1936 out of pale lodgepole logs and a stone foundation. There is no road to it. You hike in or you fly in by helicopter when the weather allows, which is rarely. I have known about the cabin since I was 8 years old because my father kept a Polaroid of it taped to the inside of his locker at the Apgar station. He was photographed standing on the porch holding a coffee tin, smiling in that thin way he smiled, the dog at his feet. The Polaroid was the last picture of him alive. He went up to the cabin on a routine 3-week rotation in October of 1998 and never came back. They found his rifle, his pack, his journal, and his hat, all stacked neatly inside the cabin like he had set them down to step out for water. They never found him. I was 12 when that happened. I was 38 when I took his old job. The decision was not as romantic as it sounds. I had just come out of a divorce that gutted me. My wife had been faithful and patient for 7 years and had finally kindly told me I was a man who lived inside himself and would not let her in. She was right. I had been transferred down to a desk position at the regional office in Bozeman after a back injury, and I was drinking too much, and I had been told my blood pressure was the blood pressure of a 60-year-old man. When the seasonal posting at Hollow Antler came up, and they post it every year and almost no one applies for it because it is lonely, because the cabin has a reputation, because the name of the last ranger who held it for any real length of time is still my father's. I put in the paperwork before I let myself think about it. My supervisor, an older woman named Henrika Bonner, called me into her office and asked me point blank if I was sure. She had known my dad. She remembered. I told her yes. I told her I needed time alone in the country to think about my life. I told her, and I believed it when I said it, that I wanted to walk the trails my father walked and feel close to him in the way men sometimes need to feel close to their fathers. She gave me the posting. She also gave me a long look I did not understand at the time, the way a physician looks at a patient she is sending into surgery she is not sure they will survive. I flew in on the 2nd of September. The pilot, a Blackfeet kid named Dustin Many Hides, set the helicopter down on a flat gravel bar at the south end of the lake and helped me unload my gear in maybe 4 minutes flat. He kept his rotors spinning. He did not shut down. When I asked him if he wanted a coffee before the flight back, he shook his head and said something I have thought about 100 times since. He said, "My uncle worked your dad's old route. He won't fly into this drainage anymore. I do it because I'm young and I need the hours." Then he tipped his cap, climbed back into the cockpit, and was airborne inside of a minute. I watched the helicopter clear the ridge and disappear, and the sound of the rotors faded into the wind, and the wind faded into nothing, and I was alone. The cabin was exactly as my father had left it, in some ways. The same iron stove. The same plank floor with the same dark stain near the door that I had asked Henrika about and that she had told me was wood preservative and not blood. The same hand-drawn topographic map tacked to the wall above the desk. There was a new propane refrigerator and a new radio, and someone had replaced the bunk mattress sometime in the early 2000s, but otherwise I was standing in a museum of my father's last weeks alive. I sat down on the porch step and drank a cup of coffee from the camp stove and watched the lake. Hollow Antler is not a beautiful lake. I want to say that plainly. It is roughly oval, about a mile long and half a mile wide, ringed on 3 sides by old-growth larch and Engelmann spruce that grow right down to the waterline and lean over the water like they are listening to something underneath. The 4th side, the north side, is a scree slope that climbs almost 2,000 feet to a ridge that is snow-covered 9 months of the year. The water itself is dark, not blue, not green, but a brown-black that I have only ever seen in tannin-rich water, the color of strong tea held up to the light. The surface, when I first saw it that afternoon, was perfectly still. There was no wind on the water, although the wind was moving in the trees behind me. I noted that. I did not understand it yet, but I noted it. That first evening I unpacked my gear, tested the radio, walked the perimeter of the clearing, and sat down with my father's old journal, which the Park Service had given me when I asked. I read it cover to cover, by the light of the kerosene lamp, while a moth the size of my thumb beat itself against the window glass. The journal was mostly bureaucratic. Weather, wildlife counts, a sprained ankle, a lost fisherman walked back to the trailhead at Logging Lake. The last entry was dated October 7, 1998. It read in his careful block printing, "Heard E on the lake last night. Cannot have been her, going out to look in the morning." E was my mother. She had died of breast cancer in the spring of 1996, 2.5 years before that entry. My father had buried her himself. I closed the journal, put out the lamp, and lay down on the bunk. The lake was quiet. The wind was quiet. Somewhere out across the water a loon called once, a long descending note, and then the silence came back in. I should have left in the morning. I want you to know I considered it. I considered it more than once, but I was a procedural man, and the only evidence I had was a single line in a dead man's journal, and my supervisor had given me the posting, and my pride was loud, and my grief was louder, and the sun came up the next day on a cabin in a clearing by a still black lake, and I told myself I would stay until October. The first week was uneventful in the way that real fear is uneventful before it begins. I did my job. I patrolled the perimeter trails on foot, which took most of a day. I checked the bear-resistant food cache at the old fire ring. I logged weather observations at 0700 and 1900 every day and radioed them in to West Glacier. I caught 2 cutthroat trout in the lake with a borrowed pole and ate them pan-fried with rice. I read a paperback novel I had brought along and found it harder to read than I had remembered. The cabin had a small library of agency-issued books and battered old paperbacks left by previous rangers. Westerns mostly, and one waterlogged copy of the King James Bible with somebody's notes penciled in the margins. The notes were not religious. They were a tally, hash marks, in groups of 5. I counted them. There were 83. I did not see another human being for 9 days. What I want to communicate is the quality of the silence at Hollow Antler. I have worked backcountry postings in the Frank Church and the Selway Bitterroot and the Eastern Sierra. I have slept alone in tents in country where the closest road was 40 miles away. I know quiet country. Hollow Antler was different. It was not that there were no sounds. There were sounds, the lap of water on the gravel, the wind in the larches, the occasional knock of a pileated woodpecker on a snag, the night chorus of owls. It was that the sounds did not add up to a place. They felt placed, like a sound man on a film set was running them through a board. I noticed on my 3rd day that the chickadees in the trees behind the cabin called for exactly 2 minutes each morning at first light and then stopped. I noticed that there were no squirrels, none. Glacier is full of red squirrels and pine squirrels. They are the loudest animal in the woods. They scream at you from every tree, and at Hollow Antler there were none. I checked the surrounding stands for middens and found none. I made a note in my report. I assumed disease or a recent fire I was unaware of. I had reasonable explanations for all of it in those first days. That was important to me. The first thing I could not explain happened on the night of September 11th. I had gone to bed around 10. The stove was banked. The lamp was out. I was lying with my eyes closed, listening to the cabin settle, when I heard my name. It was a man's voice. It was not loud. It came from somewhere out on the lake, maybe 100 yards off the porch, and it said Coca once, in the long drawn-out way my father used to call me in for supper when I was a boy. Ta-ho-me. 3 notes, the middle one held. I sat up in the bunk. My heart was going. I waited. I told myself I had been half asleep. I told myself it had been a loon, or a barred owl, which can sound startlingly like a human voice if you are not used to them. I had been listening to barred owls in northern Idaho for 15 years. This was not a barred owl. I got up. I put on my pants and my boots and my coat. I took the maglite and the .45 and I went out on the porch and stood there for 10 minutes listening. The lake was a sheet of glass. The moon was about 3/4 and very bright. I could see the far shore clearly, the dark wall of the trees, the pale strip of gravel at the waterline. There was nothing on the water. There was no sound at all. I stood there until my hands got cold, and then I went back inside and locked the door, which I had not been bothering to do, and I sat at the desk with the lamp on and waited for morning. It did not come back that night. In the daylight I told myself a number of stories. A hunter, lost or trespassing, calling to his partner across the water, choosing my name by coincidence. A trick of the wind through a hollow snag. The early stages of grief-induced auditory hallucination, which is well documented and which I had read about after my mother died. Any of those stories were more likely than the alternative, which I would not even let myself form into words. I radioed in for my morning weather observation, and dispatch confirmed there were no permitted hunters or backcountry travelers in the drainage. The closest party was a 4-day fishing trip on Logging Lake, 11 miles south. The next thing happened 2 nights later, and it was worse because it was during the day. I was on the South Trail, maybe a mile from the cabin, doing a routine sign survey, checking for fresh tracks, scat, claw marks on trees, when I heard a woman's voice from the bench above me say, "Help." Just the one word, very clear, very close. Maybe 15 yards uphill, in a tangle of beer grass and down timber. I called back. I identified myself. "Park Service Ranger, hold your position, I'm coming up." I crashed up the slope through the brush with the radio in one hand. There was no one there. There were no tracks. The ground was soft from a rain 2 nights before, and it would have held a print. There was nothing. I stood on the bench and I called out and got no answer, and I worked a grid pattern out from the spot for 45 minutes, and the woods stayed silent around me. When I came back down to the trail, I noticed that my own boot prints were the only prints on it, going up and going back, and that fact disturbed me more than the voice had. That night I sat at the desk with my father's journal open and read the last entry again. "Heard E on the lake last night. Cannot have been her. Going out to look in the morning." I went back through the journal more carefully. There were other things, now that I knew what to look for. Earlier in the rotation, my father had written about hearing what sounded like the Marsden party calling from the North Shore at dusk. The Marsden party was a family of 4 that had gotten lost in the drainage in 1991. My father had been part of the search team. They had been missing for 9 days when their bodies were recovered, all 4 of them less than 2 miles from where my father was hearing them 7 years later. I knew the case. I had read the file before I came up. I closed the journal and went out on the porch. The lake was still. The far trees leaned over the water. Somewhere far off, on the North Shore, a child laughed. I stood there a long time. The laugh did not come again. I went back inside and I did something I had not done in 20 years, which was kneel down beside the bunk and try to pray. I am not a religious man. My mother was. The words I half remembered did not come out right, and I gave up halfway through and just sat with my forehead against the rough wool blanket and breathed. When I finally got into the bunk and lay back, I heard the laugh again. This time it was not from the lake. This time it was from the floor, directly underneath me, like a small child was lying on her back on the floorboards beneath the bunk and laughing up at me through them. It went on for about 4 seconds. Then it stopped. Then nothing for the rest of the night. Although I did not sleep. 3 days after the laugh under the floorboards, I got a real call. It came over the radio at 14:30 in the afternoon, a Tuesday. Dispatch out of West Glacier, voice of a woman named Bree, whom I knew slightly, all business. Party of 3-day hikers had failed to return to the trailhead at Logging Lake the previous evening. Family had reported them missing this morning. Last known route had taken them up the North Fork of Logging Creek, which dead-ended in a basin about 4 miles south of my position. Conditions were deteriorating. Forecast called for snow above 8,000 feet by nightfall. Could I deploy in support of the search team coming up from the south? I said yes. I said I could be at the basin in 3 hours on foot. I said I would carry a thermal blanket pack and a spare radio and start a sweep of the upper bench while the south team worked the creek bottom. Bree confirmed and gave me the names and physical descriptions of the missing party. 2 men and a woman, 20s to early 30s, all from Spokane, hiking with a yellow Labrador. I packed in 12 minutes. I was glad to be moving. I was glad to have a job that was a job, with procedures and radio check-ins and a missing person form to fill out. I had not been sleeping well since the laugh, and I welcomed the work. It is important that you understand that. I was not in a state of fear when I left the cabin that afternoon. I was in a state of professional focus. Nothing I had heard in those first 10 days, not the voice on the lake or the woman on the trail or the child under the floor, was going to stop me from going to find 3 lost civilians before dark. I made the basin in 2 hours and 40 minutes. I hit the upper bench while there was still good light, found tracks almost immediately, and called them in. The tracks were the right size and the right tread, and there were 3 sets of them and 1 dog. They were headed east, not back toward the trailhead. They had crossed the bench and continued into a side drainage that, if you followed it long enough, would put you on the south slope above Hollow Antler Lake. I followed the tracks. I called as I went. I called the names Bree had given me, Jonas, Caleb, Yvonne, and I got no response, only my own voice coming back off the rock walls. The light was going, the wind had shifted around to the north, and the smell of snow was on it. I was perhaps 2 miles from the cabin, on the southern slope of the lake's basin, when I heard the dog bark. It was a dog. I knew dogs. I had grown up with a Labrador almost exactly like the one Bree had described. The bark was the right pitch and the right cadence, 2 short barks and then a long one, the way a lab will sound off when she has found something she wants you to come look at. It came from below me, down toward the lake, off to my left. I went toward it. This is the part I have the hardest time writing. I have written it 3 times now, and erased it twice. I want you to understand that I am a competent man in the woods. I have a master's degree in forestry. I have led search and rescue operations in 7 states. I had that afternoon a topographic map and a compass and a GPS unit and a fully charged radio and 20 years of professional discipline, and I went toward the dog. The dog kept barking every 30 seconds or so, and every time it barked it was a little farther down the slope and a little more to the left, and I followed it through a stand of dead snags and across a small avalanche chute and down into a thicket of mountain alder so dense I had to crouch to push through it. The light was failing. The barking was perhaps 50 yards in front of me. I was calling the dog's name, the name Bree had given me, which was Maple, and the dog was not coming. The dog was leading. I came out of the alder onto a small flat clearing, perhaps 30 feet across, and I stopped. There was no dog. There were no tracks. There was nothing but a single cairn of stones, about 3 feet high, in the exact center of the clearing. Beside the cairn was a folded green ranger jacket, faded almost gray. I knew the jacket. I had a Polaroid of my father wearing it on the porch of a cabin. I stood there. I do not know for how long. The dog did not bark again. The wind had stopped. From somewhere behind me, in the alder I had just come through, a man's voice said, very calmly and very clearly, "Toka, don't pick it up." It was my father's voice. It was exactly my father's voice. The cadence, the slight hoarseness, the way he said my name with the stress on the first syllable. It was not a memory. It was not a hallucination. It was a sound, in the air, behind me, at the distance of perhaps 15 feet. I did not turn around. I do not know why I did not turn around. I think I knew that whatever was behind me was not my father, and I think I knew that if I turned and saw it, I would not survive seeing it. I stood facing the cairn and the jacket, and I made my hands stay at my sides. The voice said it again. "Coca, don't pick it up. Walk back to the cabin. Don't run. Don't look at me." I walked. I did not look back. I walked back through the alder and up the avalanche chute and across the dead snags and back to the trail. I walked for 40 minutes in the gathering dark. I did not run because the voice had told me not to run, and because some animal part of me understood that running was what it wanted. The voice did not speak again. Twice, behind me, I heard the dog bark, the same 2 short and 1 long. But the dog was always the same 50 yards behind me, no closer and no farther, and once I thought I heard it laugh. I made the cabin at full dark. The first snow of the year was just beginning to come down out of the wind. I shut the door and shot the bolt and pulled the heavy wooden chair against it, and I got down on the floor with my back against the chair and my .45 in my lap, and I sat there and I cried for a long time. The radio went off at 21:10. It was Bree. The South team had found Jonas, Caleb, and Yvonne and the dog Maple alive, all 4 of them sheltering in a snow cave they had dug at the head of the wrong drainage. They were cold and dehydrated but otherwise unhurt. I confirmed receipt and signed off. The radio went silent. About a minute later, my own voice came out of the radio speaker. It said very calmly, "Bree, this is Hollow Antler. I'm coming back to the trailhead. Have a vehicle waiting." It was my voice. It was my exact voice. I had not keyed the mic. I unplugged the radio at the wall and sat in the dark, and the snow came down, and the lake outside the window was very still. I did not sleep. I had not really slept in 3 days, and I did not sleep that night either. I sat with my back against the chair against the door, the .45 in my hand, and I listened. The snow came down all night, a soft hiss against the cabin roof, and underneath the hiss I listened for anything else, and once or twice, very far away, I thought I heard something, a single word, a fragment of a laugh, but it was always at the edge of hearing, where you cannot be sure if you heard it or made it up. By morning the world outside was white. About 4 inches had come down in the night. The lake was still unfrozen, but the trees were heavy with snow, and the silence had the hard, packed quality that snow gives to a forest. I made coffee. I plugged the radio back in. I called West Glacier and told Bree in a steady voice that I was fine, that the previous evening's transmission about coming back to the trailhead had not been from me, that I suspected my radio was malfunctioning, and could she check the logs for the exact timing. She put me on hold for a long time and came back and said the transmission had been logged at 2111 from my call sign, and that my voice print had matched. She asked if I was all right. I said I was. I asked her to send a maintenance team up at the next available weather window to check the radio. She said she would. She also said in the voice of a friend rather than a dispatcher, "Tukuma, do you want to be relieved early?" I said no. I said I had 3 weeks left and I would finish the rotation. I do not know why I said that. I have asked myself 100 times since. I think part of it was pride. I think part of it was that I needed to know finally what had happened to my father. I think the largest part of it, although I am only admitting this now, was that I no longer believed I would be allowed to leave. I spent the morning going through the cabin in a way I had not yet done. I pulled the desk away from the wall. I lifted the rag rug. I opened every drawer and tin and box. I was looking for something, although I could not have told you what. I found it about an hour in, behind a loose plank in the wall above the bunk. I had noticed the plank on my first night and assumed warping. It was not warping. It had been pried out and replaced. Behind it was a hollow space about the size of a shoebox, and inside the hollow space was a leather-bound journal I had never seen before. It was not my father's. The handwriting was older and shakier, and the paper was yellower. The first entry was dated June 12, 1962. The name on the inside cover was Eldon Wickwire. I knew the name. Eldon Wickwire had been the third name on the Hollow Antler list, the ranger before my father. He had walked out of the cabin in the spring of 1963 and disappeared into the woods. They never found him either. I sat down on the bunk and read the journal cover to cover. It took me 4 hours. I am not going to copy out the whole of Eldon Wickwire's journal here. I will tell you what it said in summary because the details of it are not for casual reading. Wickwire had figured out, by the end of his rotation, what was at Hollow Antler. He did not give it a name. He referred to it only as the listener. He believed, based on his own observations and on conversations he had had with 2 old Kootenai men in the village of Elmo before he took the posting, that something lived in the basin that learned voices. It learned them slowly, by listening, over years. It had once learned Kootenai. Then, after the white settlers came, it had begun to learn English. It used the voices it had learned to draw people deeper into the country, and what it did with them when it had drawn them deep enough Wickwire did not know, because no one who had been drawn deep had ever come back. It could not, Wickwire believed, force you. It could only call. If you answered, you were taken. If you did not answer, if you sat in the cabin with the doors barred and the windows closed and refused to go out, even when it called in the voice of someone you loved, it could not come in. Wickwire had figured this out in his 5th week. He had stayed in the cabin for 9 more weeks, refusing to come out, surviving on the food cache and on rainwater off the roof. The journal entries grew shorter and stranger. The last entry, dated September 4, 1962, read, "It is wearing my mother's voice now. My mother has been dead for 31 years. I will not go out. I will not go out. I will not go out." The journal stopped there. There were perhaps 40 blank pages remaining. Wickwire was reported missing the following spring, when the next ranger flew in and found the cabin empty. They had assumed he had broken down, walked out into a winter storm, and died. They had filed it under exposure. I closed the journal and sat for a long time. The snow had stopped. The sun had come out. The lake outside the window was very bright. I should have done what Wickwire did. I want you to understand that I knew at that moment what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to sit in the cabin and not go out, and I was supposed to wait for the maintenance team to fly in, and I was supposed to leave with them. I had food, I had a stove, I had a weapon. I could have done it. I went outside. I did it because of a tree. About 40 yards from the cabin, on the lakeshore, was a single old larch that I had walked past 100 times in the last 2 weeks. From the cabin window that morning, I looked at it and saw for the first time that something was carved into the trunk at about chest height. The carving was old. The bark had grown over part of it. I had not been able to see it before because the angle had been wrong, or because the snow had highlighted it, or because I had not been ready to see it. I went out to read it. The carving said, in block letters, my father's initials and a date. The date was October 11, 1998. 4 days after my father's last journal entry. Below the initials, in much fresher carving, in handwriting I did not at first recognize, was a single word, SN. I was standing in the snow looking at that word when the voice spoke again, behind me, very close. Not from the trees, from the lake, from somewhere just out on the water, a few feet from shore. It said in my father's voice, "Coma. I'm so cold." I turned around. I should not have turned around. Wickwire had told me. The voice had told me the night before. I turned around anyway. What I saw in the water I am not going to describe. I have tried. I cannot do it. It was not my father. It was something that had been listening to my father for 28 years, and it had learned him very well, but it had not learned what he looked like. What was in the water at the edge of Hollow Antler Lake had not been a man, ever. It had only been a listener. Its mouth was in the wrong place for the voice to be coming out of it. There was too much of it under the surface and not enough above. The eyes, when it looked at me, were not eyes. I ran. I made the cabin in maybe 20 seconds. I do not remember the run. I remember slamming the door and dropping the bolt and falling against it with my back and sliding to the floor, and I remember that my hand was bleeding, although I do not remember when I cut it. I remember sitting against the door and listening to the silence outside and waiting for the voice. The voice did not come. What came was worse. For the rest of that day, and through the night, and into the next morning, the listener worked through every voice it had ever learned at Hollow Antler. It started with my father. It moved on to my mother, whose voice I had not heard in 30 years, and which it had clearly learned through my father's own grief, secondhand, because some of the inflections were wrong but the love in it was right. It used the voice of a child I did not know, a girl, maybe 7 years old, calling for her dad. And I sat against the door, and I thought of the Marsden family, of the daughter who had been 7, and I put my hands over my ears, and I did not go out. It used the voice of Eldon Wickwire, although I had never heard Wickwire's voice and could only assume it was his, and Wickwire said please and please and please. It used the voice of my ex-wife, which it should not have been able to know, and I have thought about that since, and I think the explanation is that it had been studying me, just me, since I had arrived, and that some of what it had learned to say to me it had pieced together from the way I talked in my sleep. It used the voice of a man I had served with in the Marine Corps in 2004, who had died in front of me at a checkpoint outside Ramadi, and the things it said in his voice were things he had said in his last 20 seconds of life, and I do not know how it knew them, and I have stopped trying to know. It went on for about 16 hours. It tried at the end my own voice. It called me from outside the door in a perfect imitation of my own voice, and it said, "Coca, open the door. I'm out here. The other one is inside. Open the door to Homa, please." And in my exhaustion and my terror I almost did. I had my hand on the bolt. I stopped because I noticed that my own voice, on the other side of the door, was crying, and I had not cried since the night before, and the timing was wrong. It stopped finally around 10 o'clock the next morning. The sun came up. The snow was melting off the cabin roof. The lake outside the window was still and brown-black and ordinary. I sat against the door for another 2 hours before I let myself believe it was over. The maintenance team flew in the following afternoon. They were 2 men I did not know, a pilot and a tech, both younger than me. They walked in the front door, looked at me, and one of them quietly went back out to the helicopter and returned with a thermal blanket. I had not eaten in 2 days. I had lost, they told me later, about 11 pounds. They asked me what had happened. I told them the radio had malfunctioned. They asked me if I was all right. I told them I was. They asked me if I wanted to come back to West Glacier with them. I said yes. I was not relieved early, officially. The paperwork shows that I completed my full rotation at Hollow Antler. The paperwork shows a clean closeout. The paperwork shows a recommendation in my own hand that the cabin be considered for decommissioning due to advanced structural decay. A recommendation Henrika Bonner, when she received it, accepted without question. The cabin at Hollow Antler Lake was officially decommissioned in November of last year. It will not be staffed again. The Park Service has, in its quiet way, agreed without ever saying so that the place is finished. I carried 2 things out of that cabin that I should not have carried. The first was Eldon Wickwire's journal. I have it in a fireproof safe in my apartment in Bozeman. I read from it sometimes. I have considered burning it. I have not burned it because I think someone someday will need it the way I needed it. The second is harder to explain. Since I came down from Hollow Antler 6 months ago now, I have noticed that I have begun occasionally to speak in voices that are not mine. It happens when I am alone. It happens when I am tired. It happens once or twice a week. I will be making coffee, or shaving, or driving on an empty road, and I will hear myself say a sentence in a voice that is not my voice. Sometimes it is my father's voice. Once it was the voice of a woman calling for help. Once last month, it was a child laughing. I do not know what this means. I have an appointment with a neurologist next week. I have not told her yet what I am actually going to ask her about. I have told my therapist some of it, but not all of it. I have told no one the full story until now. I am writing this down because I think I owe it to my father, who heard my mother's voice on the lake and went out to look. I am writing this down because I think I owe it to Eldon Wickwire, who wrote his own warning into the wall and was not believed. I am writing this down because there is a part of me, a part I am trying very hard not to listen to, that thinks the listener at Hollow Antler did not let me leave for free. I think it gave me something to carry. I think it gave me a small piece of itself, in the form of the voices, and I think it is using me slowly to learn the voices of the people in my life. My ex-wife, my supervisor, the 2 men on the maintenance crew, the receptionist at the medical office, the barista at the coffee shop on Main Street. Anyone I speak to, for any length of time, it now hears. I do not know what it is going to do with what it learns through me. I do not know if it can leave the basin. I do not know if it can call from a place other than that lake. I have not gone back to Glacier since. I do not intend to. But last night, very late, I was lying in bed in my apartment in Bozeman, and I was almost asleep, and I heard, from the other side of my bedroom door, very softly, a voice. It was the voice of the woman I am beginning to date. Her name does not matter. She has never been to my apartment. She was at her own home, 90 miles away, and she was asleep. The voice said my name. It said, Komaka. Open the door, please. I did not open the door. I will not open the door. I am going to mail this account, when I am finished writing it, to a friend who edits a small online forum where people share true stories of strange experiences in the American backcountry. I am going to ask him to post it for me. I am going to ask him to leave my name on it. If you are a ranger, or a hunter, or a backcountry traveler, and you are reading this, and you are alone in a cabin somewhere far from a road, and you hear someone you love calling you from the trees, someone who should not be there, someone who cannot be there, I am asking you to do what Eldon Wickwire did, and what I did, and what my father did not do. Stay inside. Bar the door. Do not answer. Do not go out. I took the ranger position at Glacier National Park for a reason most people wouldn't understand. After my brother disappeared on the Highline Trail 3 years ago, the official report called it a tragic accident. Hypothermia, they said, though they never found his body. Just his camera half buried in snow near a place called Nasukan Lake, the photos showing nothing but trees and darkness. The Park Service closed the case. I couldn't, so when the posting appeared for a seasonal ranger at the remote Kintla Lake Station, I applied immediately. The job description warned about isolation, weeks alone in a cabin with minimal radio contact, responsible for monitoring the backcountry trails where few hikers ventured. Perfect. I needed to be exactly where my brother had been, to understand what the forest had taken from him. They hired me in April. By May, I was driving the rutted forest road toward Kintla Lake, my truck groaning over rocks and fallen branches. The ranger who trained me, a weathered man named Vernon, spent 2 days showing me the basics before he left for the season. You'll be alone out here, he said on his last evening, standing on the cabin's porch. The lake stretched before us, perfectly still, reflecting the mountains like dark teeth against the sky. Radio works maybe half the time, satellite phones for emergencies only. Most days you won't see another soul. That's fine, I told him. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You get used to the sounds. The forest makes noise at night, branches breaking, animals moving. Sometimes it sounds like footsteps. Sometimes it sounds like voices. Your mind plays tricks after a few weeks alone. I can handle it. Vernon nodded slowly. There's one thing I need to tell you. In 20 years working this territory, I've learned there are places you don't go after dark. Areas where the wildlife acts wrong. I've marked them on your map, 3 locations around the North Shore and 1 up near Nasukan Creek. He paused. If you see ladders in the woods, turn around immediately. Ladders, wooden ones standing upright between trees. No reason for them to be there. No trails nearby. No old ranger stations. They just appear sometimes, 20 or 30 feet tall, leaning against nothing. I don't know who puts them there or why, but every time I found one, something bad followed. I wanted to press him for details, but his face had gone rigid. He left the next morning without saying goodbye. The first week passed quietly. I hiked the trails, checking campsites and monitoring for bear activity. The work was straightforward. Record observations, report hazards, assist the occasional backpacker who made it this far north. At night, I studied my brother's case file and the maps he'd marked before his final hike. He'd been interested in Native American history, particularly the Blackfeet stories about the mountains. His notes mentioned Nasukan, a word meaning place where you don't go. The old people had names for certain valleys, certain ridges, that translated to warnings. My brother had written one phrase repeatedly in his journal. They say something walks hungry in the high country. On my 8th day, I found the first ladder. It stood in a grove of lodgepole pines 3 miles up the Boulder Creek Trail, exactly upright despite no visible support. The wood looked old but not weathered, and it reached up into the canopy where thick branches should have blocked it. No footprints surrounded it. No marks in the earth suggesting it had been dragged there. I circled it twice, my ranger training telling me to document the anomaly, my instincts screaming to leave. In the end, I took 3 photos and marked the location on my GPS before hiking back to the cabin faster than I'd intended. That night I heard the footsteps Vernon had mentioned. They came from the north, from the direction of Nasukan Creek. Heavy and deliberate, crunching through undergrowth. I stood on the porch with my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees, seeing nothing. The steps continued for nearly an hour, circling the cabin at a distance I estimated to be 50 yards. Never closer, never farther. When they finally stopped, the silence that followed felt worse. I didn't sleep. I sat at the cabin's small table, my brother's journal open before me, reading his final entries by lamplight. There's something about the hunger, he'd written. The old stories all mention it. Not just starvation, but a spiritual emptiness that consumes everything. The Blackfeet say it can take human form, that it walks on 2 legs but isn't human anymore. They say it hunts in places where people go missing. At dawn, I radioed the main ranger station. The static was bad, but I managed to report the ladder and ask about previous sightings. The dispatcher's voice crackled back. We've had reports. Protocol is to note the location and avoid the area. Do not attempt to move or investigate the structures. Why? I asked. What are they? The static grew worse. Through the interference, I thought I heard her say, we don't know. But people who spend too much time near them start reporting behavioral changes in the wildlife. The radio died completely after that. I spent the morning trying to fix it, eventually giving up and deciding I'd need to hike to the main station, a full day's journey to get a replacement. I was preparing my pack when I saw the hiker. She came stumbling down the trail from the north, moving erratically, and I ran to meet her halfway. She was young, maybe 25, wearing gear that suggested she knew what she was doing. But her eyes had a glazed quality, and she didn't seem to recognize me at first. Are you all right? I caught her arm as she swayed. I'm a ranger. What happened? She blinked slowly, focusing on my face. I got turned around, near the creek. I was following the trail markers, but then they were gone. I walked for hours. The trees all looked the same. Nasukan Creek? I don't know its name, but there were structures, tall wooden structures like scaffolding. I thought maybe they were for fire watches. She gripped my arm suddenly, her fingers digging in. Something was following me. I never saw it, but I could hear it breathing. Heavy breathing, like it had been running. But when I'd stop to listen, it would stop too. I brought her to the cabin, gave her water, checked her for injuries. She had scratches on her arms and face from branches, but nothing serious. As she drank, I asked where she'd left her gear. I dropped my pack when I started running, she said. I had to run. The breathing got closer, and then I heard my name. Someone called your name? My voice, she whispered. It was calling to me in my own voice, from somewhere behind me in the trees, saying help me, over and over. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. I remembered my brother's note, creatures capable of imitating human voices. You're safe now, I told her, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Rest here. I'll radio for an evacuation. But the radio remained dead, and when I tried the satellite phone, I found its battery completely drained despite being fully charged that morning. The hiker, her name was Jennifer, fell asleep on the cabin's cot, exhausted beyond measure. I stood on the porch as afternoon faded to evening, watching the tree line. The forest had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No birds, no insects, no wind, just stillness and the sound of my own breathing. Then, from somewhere north of the lake, I heard it, my own voice, calling from the darkness between the trees. "Help me," it said. "Please, someone help me." Jennifer woke screaming just after midnight. I'd been dozing in the chair by the door, my flashlight in one hand and my radio in the other, still trying to raise someone on any frequency. Her scream brought me fully awake, and I found her sitting upright on the cot, eyes wide and fixed on the window. "It's outside," she whispered. "It's looking in." I turned slowly toward the window. The glass reflected only lamplight and our own pale faces. Beyond it, darkness pressed against the cabin like something solid. I moved to the window and angled my flashlight through it, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the lake's black surface. "There's nothing there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You didn't see it." Jennifer hugged herself, shaking. It had a face, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes were too far apart, the mouth was too wide, and it was smiling. I checked all the windows, then the door, confirming everything was locked. The cabin was solid, built in the 1960s with thick log walls and a heavy door that bolted from inside. We were safe here. We had to be. "Tell me exactly what you saw before you came down the mountain," I said, pulling the chair closer to her. "Every detail you can remember." She took a shuddering breath. "I started hiking 4 days ago from the Bowman Lake trailhead. I wanted to do the northern loop, camp at Upper Kintla, then circle back. The first 2 days were normal. Beautiful, actually. I saw 2 other hikers on day 1, nobody after that. When did things change?" "Third morning. I was following the trail along Nasukan Creek when I found the first ladder. It was just standing there, impossibly tall, reaching up into the trees. I thought maybe it was for researchers or something, so I kept going. Then I found another one, and another. 5 of them, all in a line, leading deeper into the forest." My chest tightened. "You followed them." "I know I shouldn't have, but I'm a photographer. I document strange things. It seemed too perfect. I went maybe half a mile off trail, photographing each ladder." She pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling hands. "I got pictures. Want to see?" I took the phone. The battery was at 3%, but the photos loaded. Ladder after ladder, each one standing in impossible positions, some on steep slopes, some in dense undergrowth where no one could have built them. In the background of the third photo, barely visible between trees, I saw something else. "What's that?" I zoomed in on a pale shape. Jennifer leaned over to look and went rigid. "I didn't see that when I took the picture. It was humanoid but wrong. Too tall, too thin, limbs bent at angles that didn't match human anatomy. The image was blurry, but I could make out a face turned toward the camera. Even through the poor resolution, I could see what Jennifer had described. Eyes too far apart, mouth too wide. After the 5th ladder, I heard something moving in the brush," she continued. "Not like a bear or a deer, more deliberate, following me. I tried to head back to the trail, but I couldn't find it. The GPS on my phone stopped working. I walked for hours, and every time I stopped, I'd hear breathing nearby. Heavy, wet breathing, like something with a respiratory problem. Then you heard your voice." She nodded. "I thought maybe I was losing my mind, but it was so clear, calling from behind me, saying the same thing over and over. 'Help me, I'm hurt, please help me.' I started running. I don't know how long I ran. When I finally found the trail again, it was almost dark, and I just kept going until I saw your cabin." I handed back her phone. "Did you see it clearly at any point?" "Once, right before I found the trail. I looked back and it was standing maybe 30 yards away, perfectly still. It had the shape of a man but moved wrong when it finally turned away. Like its joints bent in the middle, not at the knees and hips. It went down on all 4s and just melted into the shadows." The cabin's lamp flickered. We both froze watching it. The light steadied, but now I could hear something outside. Not footsteps this time, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. "Is there another ranger station nearby?" Jennifer asked. "Somewhere we could go?" "The main station is 15 miles south, but we can't hike it at night, not if something's out there." I moved to the window again, listening. "We stay here until dawn, then we move fast." "What if it tries to get in?" I didn't have a good answer for that. Instead, I went to the cabinet where Vernon had stored supplies and pulled out 2 items I'd seen on my first day but hadn't thought much about. a flare gun, and a box of shells. I loaded one, checked that the second flare was ready. Rangers aren't supposed to carry firearms in most situations, I explained. But we have these for bear encounters. I don't know if it'll work on whatever that is, but it's something. The dragging sound circled the cabin. I tracked it by ear, east side, then south, then west. It stopped at the north wall, directly behind where Jennifer sat. She heard it too, and scrambled to the other side of the room. Then came the voice. Please help me. My brother's voice, unmistakable even after 3 years. I'm hurt. I need help. My hand tightened on the flare gun. Jennifer stared at me, confused. Someone you know? She whispered. My brother. He died here 3 years ago. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. That's why I took this job. I'm so cold, my brother's voice continued. I can't feel my legs. Please, I'm right here. Just open the door. Every instinct screamed at me to respond, to do something. But I forced myself to stay still, to remember that my brother was gone, that whatever was outside wearing his voice was not him. It's studying us, I said quietly. Figuring out what will make us open the door. Jennifer pulled her knees to her chest. How do you know? The stories. Native American folklore talks about things in the wilderness that imitate human speech to lure prey. They're called different names in different traditions, but the behavior is consistent. They mimic voices to draw people out of safety. Please, the voice outside changed. Now it was Jennifer's voice. Help me, I'm hurt. She made a small sound of terror. Don't respond, I warned. Don't acknowledge it at all. We sat in silence while the voice continued for what felt like hours. It cycled through variations, pleading, crying, screaming. Sometimes it was my brother, sometimes Jennifer, occasionally other voices I didn't recognize. Each time, it sounded more desperate, more convincing. Around 3 in the morning it stopped. The silence was immediate and complete. No dragging sounds, no breathing, no voices, just the absence of sound that felt worse than any noise. I kept the flare gun ready and watched the windows, but nothing appeared. Is it gone? Jennifer finally whispered. I don't know. As dawn approached, I began to see shapes in the darkness outside. Trees became visible first, then the ground, then the lake. Nothing moved in the growing light. No creature, no sign that anything had been there at all. When full daylight arrived, I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch. Jennifer followed, staying close behind me. The clearing around the cabin looked undisturbed. No tracks in the dirt, no broken branches, nothing to suggest something had circled the building for hours. But when I walked around to the north wall, I found them. Scratches in the wood running from the ground to about 7 feet up. Deep gouges, like something with claws had dragged them down the logs. And beneath the window, pressed into a patch of soft earth, a single print. It was roughly human-shaped but elongated, the toes too long and spread too far apart. The impression was deep, suggesting enormous weight. Jennifer photographed it with her dying phone. What is that? I thought about my brother's journal, about the Blackfeet stories, about Vernon's warning. Something that shouldn't exist, I said. Something that's been here longer than we have. We need to leave, she said. Right now. I wanted to agree, but looking at that print, at those scratches, I realized something. This thing, whatever it was, had been here all along. It had been here when my brother disappeared. It had been here through all of Vernon's 20 years. It knew these woods, knew these trails, knew how to move through them unseen. Running might not matter at all. We packed quickly, taking only essentials: water, first aid, energy bars, the flare gun, and Jennifer's camera. I left a note on the cabin door explaining the situation and our planned route, though I wasn't sure anyone would find it in time to matter. The trail south toward the main ranger station followed the lake's western shore for 3 miles before cutting inland through dense forest. Under normal circumstances, it was an easy hike, well marked and maintained. But nothing felt normal anymore. We moved fast, barely speaking, both of us constantly scanning the trees. The morning was overcast, the sky pressing down like a gray ceiling. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. The forest felt empty in a way that set my teeth on edge. After an hour, Jennifer grabbed my arm. Do you hear that? I stopped, listening. At first, nothing. Then faintly the sound of someone walking parallel to our trail, maybe 50 yards east. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and steady, matching our pace. Keep moving, I said quietly. Don't look, don't acknowledge it. We walked faster. The footsteps kept pace, never falling behind, never catching up. Just there, in the trees, following. When we reached the junction where the trail turned inland, I checked my map. 6 more miles to the main station, mostly through thick forest with limited visibility. I didn't like our odds, but we had no choice. "Wait," Jennifer said, pointing. "What's that?" Ahead, where the trail entered the trees, something stood in the shadows. Another ladder. This one shorter than the others, maybe 15 feet tall. It leaned against nothing, perfectly upright despite the slope of the ground. "We have to go around it," I said. "The trail goes right past it, then we go off trail." But when we tried to circle through the undergrowth, we found another ladder. And beyond that, another. They formed a line, blocking our path forward. "This isn't random," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "It's hurting us." She was right. The ladders created a barrier, forcing us to either turn back or— I looked north, up the slope where the lodgepole pines grew thick. In that direction, the trail to Nasukan Creek, the place where my brother had disappeared. "It wants us to go up there," I said. "Then we go back to the cabin." I shook my head. "We can't. Look." Behind us, down the trail we just walked, more ladders had appeared. They stood in a rough semicircle, cutting off our retreat. While we'd been hiking, it had been placing them, surrounding us. "How is that possible?" Jennifer demanded. "We would have seen it. We would have heard it, unless there's more than one." The footsteps in the trees had stopped. The forest held its breath. And then, from somewhere up the slope, I heard my brother's voice again. "Come find me," it called. "I'm waiting. I've been waiting so long." Jennifer looked at me with fear in her eyes. "We're trapped." I studied the map, trying to think. The ladders blocked the trail in both directions. Going off trail in this terrain was dangerous. Steep slopes, deadfall, limited visibility. We could get lost easily, which might be exactly what it wanted. But staying here was worse. Up the slope, I decided, toward Nasukan Creek. But we stay together, we stay alert, and we don't follow any voices. "You think it'll let us through?" "I think it's been guiding us since Jennifer found those first ladders. Whatever's up there, it wants us to see it." We climbed. The slope was steep, forcing us to grab branches and roots for support. My ranger uniform snagged on thorns. Jennifer slipped twice, catching herself before falling. Behind us, the sound of wood scraping against wood, the ladders moving, I realized, repositioning themselves to close off any escape route. After 20 minutes, we reached a ridgeline and stopped to catch our breath. From here, I could see down into a valley I'd never visited, a dark fold in the mountains where Nasukan Creek ran between walls of granite. The trees there grew differently, stunted and twisted, as if the soil itself was wrong. "The place where you don't go," I muttered, remembering the name's translation. "What?" "Nasukan. It's a Blackfeet word. It means a place that should be avoided, a place where the rules are different." I pointed down into the valley. "My brother came here. His camera was found near the creek. I think he was looking for something." "Looking for what?" I pulled out my brother's journal, which I'd grabbed from the cabin. He was researching stories about the Wendigo, not the commercial version, the real folklore. The Algonquin tribes talked about a spiritual corruption that could take hold in people who resorted to cannibalism, the hunger that can never be satisfied. But the Blackfeet had similar stories, called them different names. Spirits of winter and starvation that wandered the high country. "You think that's what's following us?" "I think something lives here that people have been warning about for centuries. Something that mimics, that hunts, that feeds on, I don't know what. Fear, maybe. Desperation." Jennifer stared down into the valley. "If we go down there, we're not coming back." "Maybe not, but we're not getting out any other way." I checked the flare gun, made sure it was ready. And I need to know what happened to my brother. We descended into the Nasukan Valley as the clouds overhead thickened and darkened. The air grew colder with each step, though it was late May. By the time we reached the creek, I could see my breath. The water ran black and swift, cutting between rocks worn smooth over centuries. Along both banks, the ladders stood in clusters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stretching up into the twisted trees. Some were ancient, the wood gray and crumbling. Others looked new, the lumber fresh and pale. "Who builds these?" Jennifer whispered. "Maybe no one." I touched the nearest ladder, feeling the wood. It was cold, far colder than it should be. "Maybe they grow here. Maybe they're markers." "Markers for what?" I didn't answer because I'd seen something else. Hanging from one of the higher ladders, 20 feet up, was a jacket. My brother's jacket. I recognized the red color, the patch on the sleeve from the outdoor company he'd worked for. "Stay here," I told Jennifer and began to climb. The ladder held my weight but swayed alarmingly. As I climbed higher, I noticed things hanging from other ladders nearby. A backpack, a torn shirt, a hiking boot, personal effects from different people, different times. Trophies or warnings, I couldn't tell. I reached my brother's jacket and pulled it free. The fabric was intact, no tears or damage. I checked the pockets and found his wallet, his ID still visible through the plastic window, and tucked in the inner pocket, a small digital recorder. I climbed down quickly, nearly falling in my haste. Jennifer steadied me as I hit the ground. "What is it?" "My brother's voice recorder. He used it for notes." My hands shook as I pressed play. Static first, then my brother's voice, tinny through the small speaker. Day 6. I found something near Nasukan Creek. Structures in the trees, ladders, dozens of them. Local stories say they appear in places where the boundary is thin, where things from the old world can still cross over. A pause, the sound of wind. I've been hearing my own voice calling to me since yesterday. Classic mimicry behavior described in folklore. Whatever's here, it's studying me, learning. I should leave, but I need to document this. I need proof that the stories are real. More static, then a change in his tone. "It's getting dark. I'm going to camp here tonight. Set up the camera. Try to get footage. If anything happens, if I don't make it back, I want people to know the truth. These mountains have kept secrets for thousands of years. The Native Americans knew. They marked these places, warned their children. We should have listened." A long silence, then barely audible. "Oh God. It's here. The recording ended in a burst of static. Jennifer and I stood in the cold beside the Black Creek, surrounded by impossible ladders, listening to the silence that followed my brother's last words. Then, from everywhere at once, the voices began. They came from all directions, dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all calling out in the growing darkness. Some I recognized, my brother, Jennifer, Vernon. Others were strangers, crying for help or screaming in fear or whispering threats. The voices overlapped, creating a chorus of human suffering that echoed off the valley walls. Jennifer clapped her hands over her ears. "Make it stop." I grabbed her arm, pulled her toward the creek's bank. "We need to move, now." But which direction? The ladders surrounded us, forming a maze of wooden structures that blocked our path in every direction. Between them, shapes moved in the twilight. Tall, thin forms that walked on two legs before dropping to all fours, their joints bending wrong, their movements fluid and predatory. "They're everywhere," Jennifer sobbed. I raised the flare gun, aimed at the nearest shape, and fired. The flare shot through the air with a shriek of red light hitting the creature's center mass. It ignited with a sound like tearing cloth, the flames spreading across its pale skin. For one horrible moment, I saw it clearly. The too wide mouth, the eyes set at wrong angles, the elongated limbs that bent in too many places. It made no sound as it burned, just stood there, watching us with those impossible eyes before finally collapsing into ash that the wind scattered. The other shapes retreated slightly, fading back into the shadows between the ladders. "Did you kill it?" Jennifer asked. "I don't know. Maybe just that one body." I reloaded the flare gun with shaking hands. "I don't think they're truly alive in the way we understand it. The folklore talks about spiritual entities that take physical form. You can destroy the form, but the spirit—" "How many bullets do we have?" One more flare, then nothing. The voices continued, but I noticed a pattern now. They came from specific ladders, as if the structures themselves were broadcasting the sounds. My brother's voice emanated from the ladder where I'd found his jacket. Other ladders carried other voices, each one a recording of someone who'd come here and never left. "The ladders are how it remembers," I said, understanding clicking into place. "It takes their voices, their appearances, stores them somehow. That's why Vernon warned about them. They're not just markers, they're like memory banks." "That's insane." "Is it more insane than what we've seen today?" Jennifer had no answer for that. I studied the ladders, trying to find a pattern. Most stood in random positions, but a few formed lines, like corridors through the maze. One line led deeper into the valley, toward a thick grove of dead trees. Another ran parallel to the creek, heading south. A third climbed the eastern slope. "We follow the creek," I decided, "south, toward the main trails. If we can get out of this valley, maybe we can outrun them." We moved carefully, staying close together, the flare gun ready. The shapes paced us from the shadows, never coming close enough to target clearly but never falling behind either. They moved in eerie coordination, like parts of a single organism rather than individual creatures. The voices followed us too, cycling through their repertoire of calls and screams and pleas. I tried to block them out, to focus on the path ahead, but hearing my brother's voice over and over wore at me like water eroding stone. After 20 minutes, we reached a point where the creek widened into a pool, the water unnaturally still despite the current that fed it. On the far side, the forest opened up. I could see clearer ground, larger trees, the suggestion of a trail. "We have to cross," I said. Jennifer looked at the dark water. "How deep is it?" "Only one way to find out." I went first, stepping carefully into the creek. The water was shockingly cold, soaking through my boots instantly. It reached my knees, then my thighs. The current was stronger than it looked, trying to pull me downstream. I pushed forward, using the ranger's walking stick I'd brought for balance. Halfway across, I felt something brush against my leg. I froze, peering down into the black water. Something pale moved beneath the surface, sinuous and long. Not a fish, not anything natural. "Move faster," I told Jennifer, who was behind me. "Something's in the water." She splashed forward just as the thing beneath the surface struck. It wrapped around my ankle like a rope, yanking hard. I went under, the icy water filling my mouth and nose. Underwater, I saw it clearly, a pale arm, impossibly long, extending from the shadows beneath the far bank. The fingers had too many joints and ended in black claws. I kicked hard, breaking the surface, gasping. Jennifer grabbed my jacket, pulling me toward the bank. The arm held tight, dragging me back. I still had the flare gun, somehow, gripped in my right hand. I aimed down into the water and fired. The flare ignited underwater in a burst of red light and boiling bubbles. The arm released me immediately, recoiling back into the depths. Jennifer and I scrambled onto the far bank, coughing and shaking. "No more flares," she gasped. "No more ammunition at all." I checked the gun, empty. Useless now except as a club. Behind us, across the pool, the shapes emerged from the trees. There were at least a dozen now, standing at the water's edge, watching. They made no attempt to cross, just stood there with their two wide mouths hanging open, their eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Why aren't they following?" Jennifer asked. I looked around, noticing details I'd missed before. The trees on this side of the creek were different, healthier, straighter. The air felt warmer, and carved into the bark of the nearest pine, worn but still visible, was a symbol I recognized from my brother's research. A warning marker used by the Blackfeet, indicating a boundary. "We're out of its territory," I said. "This side of the creek is normal, or normal enough." The shapes remained at the water's edge for another minute, then slowly retreated into the darkening forest. Their departure was silent, coordinated, like a tide pulling back. Within moments, they'd vanished completely. The voices stopped. The sudden silence was almost shocking. I could hear normal forest sounds again. Wind in the trees, water flowing, insects chirping. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on us since entering the valley lifted. "Is it over?" Jennifer asked quietly. "For now." I looked back across the creek, toward the ladders still visible between the trees. "But it's still there. It'll always be there." We found the trail 20 minutes later, a well-maintained path that led south through normal forest. By the time full darkness fell, we'd reached the main ranger station, where the staff responded to our story with a mix of concern and carefully controlled skepticism. They sent a search team into the Nausicaan Valley the next morning. The team found nothing. No ladders, no structures, no signs of the creatures we'd described. Just normal forest, they reported. Normal trees and normal rocks and a normal creek. But they didn't find Jennifer's backpack either, the one she'd dropped while fleeing. And when they checked the records, they discovered that 17 people had gone missing in that valley over the past 40 years. 17 people whose bodies were never recovered, who'd simply vanished into the wilderness. Vernon came to visit me in the hospital where they'd taken us for observation. He looked older than I remembered, more worn. "You went there," he said. "It wasn't a question. My brother went there first, and now you know why I tried to warn you." He sat down heavily. "I've worked these mountains for 20 years. I've learned which places to avoid, which trails to close when the ladders appear, which search areas to declare too dangerous. The Park Service knows. They've always known. But what can they do? Close half the park? Tell people that monsters are real? They could tell the truth. Would anyone believe it?" Vernon shook his head. "Your brother didn't. He was like you, wanted proof, wanted to understand. The difference is, you made it back." "What's the last thing on my brother's recording?" I asked. "After he said it's here?" The recording cut off, but did he say anything else? Vernon was quiet for a long moment. We found his recorder 3 years ago, along with his camera. The recording continued for another 3 minutes after what you heard. He was trying to communicate with it, asking it questions, treating it like a scientific subject. He paused. The last thing he said was, "I understand now. It's not evil, it's just hungry." Those words haunted me more than anything I'd seen in the valley. The idea that my brother, in his final moments, had tried to rationalize what was happening to him, to make it fit into some framework of understanding. Maybe that was the worst part. Not the creature itself, but the realization that there were things in the world that couldn't be understood, that existed outside our frameworks and explanations. Jennifer and I were discharged from the hospital 3 days later. She went home to Portland, promising to stay in touch but making no commitment to ever go hiking again. I tendered my resignation from the Park Service, but before I left, I did one last thing. I went back to the cabin at Kintla Lake, not to stay, I was done with that, but to retrieve my brother's belongings and to understand as much as I could what he'd been thinking in those final days. The cabin looked the same, untouched by the horror that had unfolded just days before. The scratches on the north wall remained, deep gouges that maintenance would have a hard time explaining. Vernon had agreed to come with me, though he stayed outside, keeping watch while I sorted through my brother's research materials. My brother had been one document caught my attention, a photocopy of an interview with a Blackfeet elder conducted in 1987. The relevant passage read, "The old people say there are spirits in the mountains that were here before humans. Most of them left when we came, retreating to places between, but some remained in the deep valleys where few people go. They are not evil in the way white people think of evil. They are hungry. They have always been hungry. They feed on the thing that makes us human, our voices, our identities, ourselves. When you hear your own voice calling from the forest, it is because the spirit has already taken part of you. The ladders are how they mark their territory, how they claim space in our world. Do not climb the ladders. Do not answer the voices. Do not go to the places where both appear together." I photographed the document along with others that seemed relevant. This information needed to be preserved, shared, made public somehow. People had a right to know what existed in these mountains, even if most would dismiss it as folklore or madness. Vernon appeared in the doorway. "You about done?" "Almost." I packed the last of my brother's journals into my backpack. "Do you ever think about quitting, leaving these mountains?" "Every day." He looked out toward the lake, where late afternoon sun sparked off the water. "But someone needs to be here, someone who knows. When hikers come through, when families ask about trails, someone needs to guide them away from the dangerous places." "How many places are there? Like Nasokan, I mean." "3 that I know of for certain in this region, maybe more in other parts of the park." He paused. "Vernon's Gorge, ironically named before I got here, is one. There's a section near Logging Lake that gets strange in late October, and a grove up near the Canadian border where compasses don't work right. And the Park Service just allows people to hike there. They close trails when they can justify it, claim bear activity or damaged bridges or fire danger, but they can't close everything. And some people," he looked at me directly, "some people need to see it for themselves. Like your brother. Like you." He was right, though I didn't want to admit it. Some part of me had needed to know, even knowing it might cost me everything. We left the cabin together, locking it behind us. I'd arranged for my brother's possessions to be shipped to our parents, along with a carefully edited version of events that omitted the impossible parts. They deserved some closure, even if it came wrapped in comfortable lies. The drive back down the forest road felt longer than the drive in. Every shadow between trees made me flinch. Every gap in the forest looked like a place where something might emerge. I knew these fears would fade with time, that the human mind was remarkably good at normalizing even the most traumatic experiences. But I also knew I'd never look at wilderness the same way again. Vernon dropped me at the park headquarters where I'd left my truck. We shook hands and I thought that would be the end of it. But as I was loading my gear, he called out, "Your brother's recorder. The last 3 minutes." I stopped, turned. "What about them?" "We never released the full recording. Too disturbing. But there's something on there I think you should know." He walked closer, lowering his voice. "After your brother said he understood, after he said it was hungry, there was a sound. Not words, but a vocalization. High-pitched, rhythmic, almost musical. We had a linguist analyze it, someone who specialized in indigenous languages, and she said it wasn't human. The pitch was wrong, the rhythm didn't match any known language structure, but there was intelligence in it. Patterns, repetitions that suggested meaning. He hesitated. She also said that listening to the recording made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain, like the sound was trying to communicate something directly to her subconscious. What happened to the linguist? She quit. Moved to Florida. Refuses to discuss the case. Vernon pulled out a small USB drive. I made you a copy. Against regulations, but I figure you've earned it. Listen if you want, or don't. Either way, you should have it. I took the drive, feeling its weight in my palm. Such a small thing to contain such darkness. Why give this to me? Because you'll do something with it. Document it, share it, make sure people know. Your brother wanted proof. Maybe this is as close as we get. I drove south as the sun set, putting miles between myself and Glacier National Park. The USB drive sat in my cup holder, a constant presence in my peripheral vision. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to forget everything I'd experienced. But a larger part, the part that was my brother's sibling, that shared his curiosity and need to understand, knew I'd eventually listen, just not yet. I stopped for the night at a motel in Kalispell, a generic chain with bright lights and other travelers and the comforting buzz of normal human activity. I bought dinner from a drive-thru, ate mechanically while watching television, and tried to sleep. The dreams came anyway. I was back in the Nisukan Valley, surrounded by ladders that reached up into a sky filled with stars I didn't recognize. My brother stood on one of the high rungs too far up to reach, his face turned away from me. You should have stayed, he said in a voice that was his but also not his, layered with harmonics that hurt to hear. You almost understood. You almost saw what I saw. What did you see? He turned then, and his face was wrong, the features still recognizably his but arranged in impossible ways, the eyes too far apart, the mouth too wide. The truth, he said, that we're not the dominant species, that we never were. We're just the ones who tell ourselves stories to feel safe. That's not true, isn't it? He gestured to the valley below, where shapes moved between the ladders, dozens of them, hundreds. They were here first. They'll be here last. We're just passing through, temporary guests in a very old house. I woke gasping, the motel room dark around me. The clock read 3:17 a.m. I turned on every light, checked the door locks twice, and spent the rest of the night sitting in the uncomfortable chair by the window watching the parking lot for movement. By morning, I'd made a decision. I drove to the local library as soon as it opened, used their computers to create a new email account under a pseudonym. Then I uploaded my brother's research, Vernon's documentation, and my own account of what happened at Nasukan Creek. I sent copies to journalists, researchers, paranormal investigators, anyone who might take the information seriously. Most wouldn't. Most would dismiss it as fiction or delusion or an elaborate hoax. But maybe one person would look at the evidence, see the pattern of disappearances, notice the warnings embedded in indigenous folklore, and understand that something old and hungry still prowled the mountains. Maybe that would be enough. I also uploaded the audio file from my brother's recorder, all of it, including the last 3 minutes Vernon had mentioned. Let people hear what I'd heard, let them decide what it meant. The file finished uploading as noon struck. I logged out, cleared the browser history, and left the library. My truck was still in the parking lot, waiting to take me anywhere but here. Before I could reach it, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Hello? Silence on the other end. Not the silence of an empty line, but the silence of someone, something, listening, breathing. Then, impossibly, my own voice spoke back to me. Thank you for sharing our story, it said. Now more will come, more will see, more will understand. The line went dead. I stood in the parking lot, phone still pressed to my ear, understanding the terrible truth. By documenting what happened, by spreading the information, I hadn't warned people away. I'd drawn them in. I'd created a map for the curious, the skeptical, the ones who, like my brother, like me, would need to see for themselves. The creatures in the valley weren't limited to that one location. They were wherever the boundary grew thin, wherever the ladders appeared. And now, because of me, more people would go looking for them. I got in my truck and drove. Not home. I didn't have a home anymore. Just drove, heading east on highways that cut through mountains and plains and forests that suddenly seemed full of hidden dangers. The USB drive remained in my cup holder. Eventually I knew I'd listen to those last 3 minutes. I'd hear whatever my brother heard, whatever made him understand. Maybe it would drive me mad. Maybe it would bring me peace. Or maybe I'd learn, as he had, that some truths are too large and too terrible to fit inside a human mind. That there are things in the deep places of the world that have always been hungry, that will always be hungry, and that were nothing but a temporary abundance in their eternal lean times. Behind me, Glacier National Park receded in my rearview mirror, but I knew I'd never truly leave it behind. A part of me was still in that valley, still climbing those impossible ladders, still hearing voices call from the darkness between trees, still trying to understand what walks hungry in the high country, and still wondering, in the darkest hours of night, if it was following me even now. Patient, persistent, waiting for the moment when I'd hear my own voice calling from somewhere I shouldn't be, saying the words that would draw me back to where the ladders stand and the boundary grows thin and the old hunger waits to feed. The road stretched ahead, endless and uncertain. I kept driving. 3 weeks later, they found my truck abandoned on a forest road outside of Helena, Montana. My wallet was on the dashboard. My phone was on the passenger seat, battery dead. The USB drive was gone. Search teams combed the area for days, finding no trace of me. The case remains open, marked as a missing person investigation. Another disappearance in the wilderness, another name added to the long list of people who walked into the trees and never came back. But if you listen carefully on certain quiet nights in certain remote places where the forests grow dark and thick, you might hear a voice calling from the shadows. It might sound like me, pleading for help, asking to be found. Don't answer. Don't go looking. Don't climb the ladders if you see them standing between the trees. Some hungers can never be satisfied. Some boundaries should never be crossed. And some stories, once they take root, grow in the telling until they become something more than stories, until they become invitations, maps, roads that lead to places where you don't go, where the old things wait with patient hunger for the next curious soul to step across the line. I hope you'll be wiser than I was. I hope you'll stay away. But I suspect, eventually, you'll need to see for yourself. And when you do, when you're standing in a valley where ladders rise between twisted trees and voices call your name from the darkness, remember that I tried to warn you. Remember that understanding comes with a price. Remember that some truths are better left undiscovered. The hunger is waiting. It's always waiting. And now, so am I.